It has been said that average people want you to stay average. Welcome to the Breaking Average podcast, the podcast designed to challenge you to break the mold that average has on the world. Each episode offers insights directly from those who choose to break average every day. Now, for the latest insights, here are your hosts, Paul Gustafson and Mike Harber.
Welcome to the Breaking Average podcast. My name is Paul Gustafson, and joining me today is my co-host, Mike Harber. Hey, Mike, how are you, man?
Hey, Paul, I am fantastic. So good to be here with you again on the Breaking Average podcast. And it's always great to have a great conversation in store for our listeners.
Yeah, we just had a great series on vision. We're going to turn the page here and get to a new factor, which I think is fantastic. And today, joining us in a moment, we have Diane and Rick, and it's always good to have them. But we're going to continue to mastermind on this whole concept of breaking average, really what it means to break average, how we can bring others along to break average. And so I love the conversations that we've been having.
Yeah, we're continuing in our series, the book Breaking Average. I'll cover up my face, but that may be a better image for those of you who are watching live on the Empowered Living Show. But if you're listening on the the Breaking Average podcast, make sure you go grab a copy of Paul's book, Breaking Average: The 7 Critical Factors to Team Strong Leadership. It can be fun, Paul. Breaking average is fun, like people get to celebrate, but it's also very, very difficult. And one of the reasons why is the world mass produces average, right? I mean, we kind of look around and say, well, at least I'm not as bad as that person. So we kind of make ourselves average instead of continuing to push the limits. But on the Breaking Average podcast, we're here to help you as a leader. We're here to help you as an individual and as an organization break average in your own world.
Yeah, that's part of the problem, the struggle, Mike, is that we measure on average. Everything that we do, we base it on the averages of our past. We use history sort of as the measuring stick in terms of how we're performing today. So when we look at, our quarterly reports and, annual impact of what we did year over year, we're looking at the averages of what we've done in the past, and we're measuring against that. And that's not necessarily a good place to be. We need to be forward thinking. So last week, in the last few podcasts, we've been talking about dreaming, really the vision, daring to dream, declaring the dream, and delivering the dream. And that's so critical, so important to do that. But you got to go a little deeper. It's not just about casting that dream. And yes, it's important to deliver it. But look, we're trying to break average. How do you go further? And you go further with insight. I think insight's really important because after vision, what we say in the book is this: after vision comes insight. Vision is the power to see something, whereas insight is the power to see into something. So don't miss the subtle difference there. It's a big difference, and it's a huge difference.
Yeah, I love that little difference that you've written about in the book, Paul. It kind of changed things for me as well. But vision is, it's about clarity, right? Creating a clear image for ourselves or for others where we want to go. And insight is really all about comprehension, comprehending how to get there, looking into the vision and say, okay, how are we going to get there? Who's going to be involved? What are the obstacles that might get in our way? So comprehension takes us from really seeing it to knowing it. And we're going to bring our friends, Rick and Diane, to dive more into this discussion this morning, Paul. But before we do that, why don't you set us up with the story from the book that you wrote about in this portion?
Well, this is a story that hopefully is going to be familiar with a lot of folks, right? So we did movies. And one of the movies that we picked was Hidden Figures. And that's a great movie, right? It really represents this story. It's the lead-in story for Insight. And so back in the 60s, right here in Virginia, where I'm at, 3 pioneering African-American women, actually there were several more, but there's 3 reflected in that movie. You can see the impact that's being made, right? And their work was integral to a number of great successes for our space program, putting man not just on the moon, but in orbit and so many other things. So watch that movie if you haven't. If you have, watch it again. But it's a great reflection of insight. because in that movie, you see those characters, those individuals, those real people that are reflected, Katherine Johnson being one of them, really adding the value to that program, putting John Glenn in orbit, essentially, right? And I love the boss. Her boss was a guy named Al Harrison, played by Kevin Costner. And Costner does a great job in this movie. And he has the ability really to kind of look beyond the status quo, right? Because we're dealing with really a tough part of our history, right? There's definitely segregation and racial division that's happening then. I know we're dealing with some struggles today, but it was even worse back then. And for the contributions to happen from an African American, especially a woman, that was rare. And yet Costner, his character, looks into that. He needs that insight from those individuals, and he does. And it's just a great story of him breaking the status quo, and he breaks the mold. And he breaks average, and that's one of my favorite stories. It's not just him, obviously. It's Katherine Johnson and the rest of her team. That's just one of the best stories that I can think of as far as insight, and that's how we set up the this section of the book.
Yeah, I love that you brought that story into the book, Paul. There's some great things in there that we'll talk a little bit more. And as we dive into it, let's bring Rick and Diane into the conversation as well. Hey, Rick. Hey, Diane. How are you guys doing?
Doing fantastic.
Diane, are you out there? Hello.
I am here. Am I still on mute?
Yeah, you're there. I hear you. We got you.
Here.
Good to see both of you. Hope you're having a breaking average day. I know you are because you're here with me. I bring everybody up. So, I know that's why y'all like to hang out with me.
That's why you brought me in, to bring you three up. Come on.
That's right. That's right.
We need the insight, right, Mike? I mean, it's about insight, and we need Rick and Diane, and we bring in, we interview different folks, and we couldn't do this podcast solo. We need the contributions of everybody. And we look, by the way, if you're watching on the Empowered Living Show or watching on the YouTube channel, or however you watch and listen to podcasts, we want your feedback because you give us insight. So make sure you take a moment to just make those comments and send those messages to us, because we're listening, we're learning, and we learn from insight. And certainly Rick and Diane are really our inside insiders in terms of what we do here with the podcast. So I appreciate both of you guys.
And Paul, speaking of insight, there's those three critical elements that are in the book. And I know today we're going to start with foresight, and the leader must first operate with foresight. And then we're going to talk about the second part is the contributions that others make and that are offered by hindsight. And you were talking about that a little bit. And then the third part of it is that engage-sight. I can't really wait to kind of dig into engage-sight, but let's talk about foresight first.
Yeah, it's so good. Those three elements, I just get jazzed about each one of them, but I think people are really going to love Engage-Sight. So follow along today with Foresight, and definitely tap into the one that we're going to talk about with Hindsight. But wait till we get to Engage-Sight. It's going to be really good.
And Paul, there was a quote that kind of hit me as I was going through and preparing for this podcast, and it's one of my favorites. But I think in order to have great foresight or insight, you've got to deal with the fear as well, right? There's a lot of fear of failure. And there's a quote by Elaine Bodden that said, "Don't despair. Despair suggests you are in total control and know what is coming. You don't. So surrender to events with hope." And I think hope and insight, as well as hope and foresight, are really a connection point that people need to remember. That foresight, you've got to have hope with that in order for that to really start to motivate or contribute to a team.
Yeah, that's so true, right? We talked about Bannister in our last podcast, and he cast a vision that had never been broken, 4-minute mile. And he stepped into, I love that thought, right? Surrendered to events with hope. And when you set hope as part of it, it helps really kind of open up that, like, hey, look, we know there's a way to make this thing happen. We know there's a way to break the 4-minute mile. I'm just going to step forward in faith that I'm going to find a way, that we're going to find a way. And when you do, then things start to open up and you start to become more aware of how that could happen. So yes, surrendering to events with hope, such a great quote. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, hope for a better future, right? I love. We've all heard the saying. We've all said it before. Leaders are dealers in hope. That's what we have to do. On the Breaking Average podcast, we want to talk to leaders who are great at inspiring others with great insight, with great hope. We want to invite you, the listener, today to introduce us to those leaders that we need to know. BreakingAveragePodcast.com/leader is the place you can go to introduce us to those great leaders that we can interview for special guests on the Breaking Average podcast. Safe way, simple way to capture their names. Just go to BreakingAveragePodcast.com/leader.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely want to hear from those leaders because those leaders give us insight. So love to hear those thought leaders and pioneers and game changers, those that are breaking average. So let us know about them. Hey, Mike, I'm excited, man. We have a super cool sponsor today, don't we?
Yeah, one of my great pleasures in life was meeting this guy named Rick Morris. And Rick used to scare me. But I think I scared him. It's one of those things when you meet people, we're all people, but sometimes you say, okay, is this guy somebody I want to get to know? I met Rick through the John Maxwell team. He was this guy that was like introducing himself, and I'm kind of leery of that. Like, what's this guy want from me? But Rick is a super guy. And as I've gotten to know him, he brings a lot of insight into helping people solve problems they can't solve on their own. Oftentimes we're working on projects, and when it's our project, when we're in the frame, we can't see some of the solutions that are out there to move things forward. And so what Rick does is he plays that role to come in with you, to partner with you as someone who brings insight into a problem and helps you move through those as a project manager. And he's done that. He's doing that with some really big names right now. I can't blow his cover right now, but he's got a really big project he's working on. You can learn more about Rick at rickamorris.com, rickamorris.com. If you've got a project that's stuck, or maybe you're a coach. I know we have a lot of coaches that listen to our show. Maybe you're a coach that goes in and does some leadership development, communication, but you've got an organization that has a project that they've been unable to move forward. Rick is your guy. rickamorris.com. Rick, thanks for your sponsorship, buddy.
Thank you.
Yeah. Hey, Rick. It's such an honor for you to be a part of this. And certainly you helped produce this thing. But insight is something, you and I have had some great dialogues. I'm missing the connection that we usually have in Orlando, right? Didn't we miss that last year?
Yeah.
And one of the powerful things that Mike just brought up was, when we first met each other, we didn't meet each other online. We met each other at a John Maxwell event. And we learned a lot in the room, but it was outside of the room that really kind of the gems of the insights that take place, right? So when you think about insight, Rick, I love to get your thoughts on this. What is insight? What is foresight? Really, let's get into that foresight part. Why does that matter? What's the leader's role in that? So what are some of your thoughts related to that?
Yeah, I want to dovetail that back into hope because really insight is the hope that it can change. And insight really is the dream of a better future for whatever that may be. If it's a product, or if it's an enhancement, or if it's changing your life. Insight first helps identify the problem, and hope allows you to see through it. William Burroughs said the best way to keep something bad from happening is to see it ahead of time, but you can't see it if you refuse to face the possibility. And what I love about that is there's two sides of that possibility. There's the possibility of what if it does work? And there's the possibility of what if it doesn't work? And I see so many people get focused or hyper focused on one or the other and not both. So they're either, oh, no matter what, we're going to make this happen. And they just kind of drive their team into the ground, or this isn't going to work. Why should we even try? And you miss an opportunity. Having both sides of that coin is something I think is really important. And why I think insight matters. And I think it's very important to say, okay, first with the hopeful side, what if this works? What would this mean if it works? And not just, what if it works, but how will it change my life or people's life or the company's life or whatever that may be, really understanding the why around that. But then all of a sudden too, be able to go, but what if it doesn't work? You know, Mike, one of our favorite sayings all the time is to fall in love with the journey, not the destination. And most people, when they have projects in my world, it's a identified destination. So it all becomes about not only did we arrive at the destination, but do we do it on time or on budget? But really, we kind of discount all of those learnings that occurred during that journey. And so I think you have to look at both sides of the coin for insight. You have to look at what if it does work? How is that going to, what is that going to look like? How is that going to feel? How does that change my life? But what if it doesn't work? What do I hope to learn? What do I hope to achieve? What do I hope to identify?
That's good. You know, one of the thoughts that came to mind here as you talked about that, what do you hope for? You know, one of the great insight, foresight guys in football was, and maybe still is, he's a commentator now, is Tony Dungy, right?
Oh, yeah.
So Tony Dungy, remember that Super Bowl? He's got Peyton Manning, maybe the best quarterback of all time. Sorry, Tom Brady, but Peyton Manning was pretty awesome too, right? Sorry, Diane. I know you're a Brady fan.
It's okay.
I like
As
Brady.
a Tennessee fan, do continue with the Peyton story.
Yeah, for sure, right? So Peyton Manning, I mean, he came out of nowhere, really. I mean, obviously he's the son of a former football player, but the impact that he made, he worked to get where he's at. But Tony Dungy was his coach in that Super Bowl, right? Tony Dungy had just built a Super Bowl team in Tampa. For whatever reason, leaves that position, goes over to Indianapolis. He's got Peyton Manning, and they go to the Super Bowl. And right, very, very before the game, this is foresight. And I wish I had the words and the story, but it's so fantastic. If you we'll find it in our show notes. We'll find the link for this, guys. But he tells his team, guys, look, something's going to go off. Something's going to go haywire in this game. You know it's going to happen. We've never played a perfect game, and nobody ever will. So when that happens, when something doesn't go right, I want you just to know that we will get through this. Do not give up. Stay in the game. We're going to find a way. We're going to work together. We're going to find a way to win this game. But we have to stay together, and we have to commit to that right now. So he's given foresight to the whole team. Well, the very first play of that game, the other team runs it back for a touchdown, like right away. And so yet they find a way to keep the resolve, and they win that Super Bowl game. Just a great story. And that's, Dungy is sort of that foresight guy. So Diane, I know it's hard to go off a Dungy quote because I know you're a big Patriots fan. I think they beat the Patriots to get to the Super Bowl. But what are your thoughts on foresight?
They might have. And I wanted to, Rick, as you were talking about hope, it reminded me of the quote in John's new book, Change Your World, right? Hope has two beautiful daughters. Their names are Anger and Courage. Anger at the way things are, and courage to see that they do not remain as they are. And back to that. So when we're talking that foresight, we're looking forward. Hope is part of that. The vision is part of that. Back to your story, Paul, we've already made a decision. We've made a decision about how we're going to react. But that whole foresight is that seeing before others see. We're looking at what could possibly happen. And it's that anticipatory leadership, right? We see where we're going, but we also know that it's never a clear path. How often have we done something that's a clear path ever?
Yeah.
So interestingly enough, since you brought up Peyton Manning, one of my favorite clips I ever saw on YouTube is actually a guy who works the film room at Tennessee. Peyton is at Denver, and he calls the guy and says, "Hey, my sophomore year, we ran this play against Arkansas, and it was 4th and 2. We were on the 3-yard line. I need that tape." And the guy's like, okay. He finds the tape, sends it to Peyton. Then they cut to a clip where Peyton is teaching the Denver offense, because in his film study against the opponent he was playing against, the NFL, he felt like a play he ran in college was going to work. So he teaches it to the Denver Broncos, and then it fast forward to the Sunday where they actually score a touchdown with the very same play. Now, you want to talk about foresight.
Yeah.
He remembered the history, found some sort of wrinkle, knew that there was a play out there that already worked, went and got the film and scored a touchdown from it. That's foresight to me.
Yeah.
So
You just had
foresight
to-
and hindsight are.
I did the dig on Arkansas.
He just had to dig at Arkansas. That's what you call blind sight.
Yeah.
Oh,
And we
that's
had
so
the
good.
hindsight that Clint Sterner was going to be our favorite son. But anyway, that's a whole nother ballgame.
Well, think about Manning though, real quick. When he was at the line, he there's a great example of somebody who's executing with foresight, right? Before the ball is snapped, he's got everybody at the line, and he really set the stage for other quarterbacks, including Tom Brady. I think a lot of those quarterbacks have really learned how Manning was really reading the defense, seeing what he had with his offense, and then using that foresight to be able to change the play if necessary and make an impact. I mean, so many great clips of him doing that. So.
But look at how much foresight is tied to hindsight, right? It's built on that experience.
Yeah.
It's always that experiential learn. We think it's all foresight, but really it's that experience that we're applying forward. So that's interesting.
Yeah.
Combination, right? It's a combination of
Yeah.
both. And I think, Paul, I love this idea of foresight. As you put in the book, it's the ability to kind of see the future. But also to be aware of the things that are going around us. Paul, there's a book that you and I are kind of reading through, Tactics and Strategy or something like that by Jocko Willink, right? Where he shares this idea of detachment, where you're kind of in the moment of leadership, but you kind of detach yourself so you can kind of see what's going around as well. I think that's kind of a form of foresight. You're in a leadership moment, but you've got to be able to look at what's going on around you and also see forward to move your team forward sometimes. And then, I think, Rick talked about hope. As leaders, sometimes people can get like stuck on what's going on around them, right? I think of my sister right now. She's battling cancer, and she's struggling with some side effects from the chemo and radiation that she's been undergoing, and in a lot of pain. And I see my role is to provide that hope for her right now, to remind her of all the people who have beat this before, to remind her of all the things that she's beat before in her life, and then paint that picture of a future that she's going to have. So it's, again, to your point, Diane, it's pulling from the past, the stories of the past, the stories of her past or others' past, but then also painting a future vision for someone to give them hope to move forward. And there's a lot of stories, Paul. You use the story of Apple and Steve Jobs and
Both Steves. Yeah, Steve Wozniak.
Yeah, both
and Steve
Steves.
Jobs.
That's right. Well, I got stuck on the first name, couldn't get the last name out then. So Wozniak and Jobs, right? And their foresight of having. I'm speaking to you all on an Apple MacBook Pro right now that I'm looking through. And that was because of their foresight, 35, 40 years ago to begin to put a personal computer on everyone's desk. Pretty awesome.
It's incredible. Yeah. It's, think of all the great innovations. It starts with foresight, right? Yeah, there's a vision for it, but a lot of people have vision, but they never do anything with it. So what do you need to do? You got to go a little deeper. You need some foresight. And the Wozniak Jobs story is just a great one, right? So you could say this idea of foresight is intuition. There is an element of intuition. And some people think, well, intuition is just one of those God-given gifts that, you either have or you don't. I think you cultivate it. Diane made a mention earlier about hindsight. Hindsight actually, which is what we'll talk about in our next podcast. And it's fantastic, just what we can do from our learning experience. Because that learning experience shapes us in the intuition stage. It really does. So we talked about Peyton Manning. It's because of all his experiences going through it, where he had the intuitive sense to make the change the play if he needed to. So this idea is it's based on what the leader knows and senses, and that's really important. Don't discredit what it is that you have. Don't discredit that intuition and what you know and sense. Pay attention to it. And it's, okay, there's some fear to it, like Diane mentioned, but there's courage, there's hope, and make sure that, you look at the positive side of it. It doesn't count unless you can fail, right? Seth Godin says that. So be open-minded in terms of the opportunity of what's there. So, all right, guys, so let's get into this other discussion. Like, how do we cultivate foresight in others? I mean, okay, so we know it's important for us to do it, but really, we're trying to groom a team. We're trying to create team strong leaders. That's the goal here. That's what Dungy did with his team. How do we do that? How can we cultivate a foresight in others? What's the play on that? So, any thoughts that you guys have on that?
I mean, I'll be happy to jump in here to go first if that's what we want to do. Is, I think first of all, Paul, what was transformational for me in what you wrote in this book about insight. I used to kind of think insight is mine, but insight can't happen without other people. I thought that was kind of a transformational thought for me, right? Or that you wrote in the book. Insight can't happen without other people, because when I only look within myself, I only have my own experience. Mm-hmm. But when I surround myself with others, I get the experience that others have had from a different perspective, right? The different experiences that you had. Like I'll use Rick, for example. I mean, he's up-leveled our podcast because of his project management experience and, slicing all of my country boy faux pas out of the podcast to make us sound better, right? That's an insight that I didn't have before. I'm just like, no, let's roll with it, man. It's good enough. But sometimes, my good enough got in the way of better. And so we're breaking average with that. And that is a transformational idea that comes out of this book. Is insight cannot happen without others. Now, how do you do that? How do you cultivate that in others? I think it begins with, number one, you got to spend time with others, right? You got to spend time with your team. You can't sit up in the ivory tower. You can't stay back in your office and only think about your own ideas and how you can do it better, which means you have to set your own ego aside. I've got a book, you may see it behind me, Ego is the Enemy by Ryan Holiday, that, Rick, I'm reading that for your sake, buddy, because I know, I got a big ego, right? I have to set my own ego aside. And then, Paul, I love the story that you shared from the Hidden Figures movie. When the ladies were walking around, they needed to go to the bathroom, and they're walking around looking for the bathroom, right? And looking for a bathroom for non-whites, because during that time there were no non-whites that worked at NASA. There were no segregated bathrooms. And so, Costner, who was their boss, ripped the label off the bathroom. And he said, we all pee the same color here. That's like cultivating insight with your team, experiencing what they experience, listening to what you need to listen to, setting your ego aside, and making a change when change needs to happen.
That's good.
Yeah, I think it's important, Mike, because how you look at it is how you'll see it, right? If you look at a situation with dread, then dreadful outcomes is what's going to await you. But if you look at it with hope and hopeful thoughts, then hopeful outcomes await. And I had a huge realization several years ago. We talked about Agile and the Agile Manifesto a couple of podcasts ago, but there's two main theories of project management. One, which was waterfall, which is we have our idea and we try to plan it out all the way to the finish. And then you start doing risk analysis and risk management and contingency plans and all this other stuff. And what I noticed was the language around waterfall is all about avoiding failure. It was all, okay, what happens if something goes wrong? Well, we've got a contingency plan, and let's think about everything that possibly could go wrong before we start. Well, that puts us in a dreadful state of mind. And it's very hard for people to come up with a lot of risks because they just came up with their greatest plan. They don't see how it's going to fail. They don't have the insight of how it's going to fail. Well, then this new hybrid comes out with Agile, and it's all the same things. I don't care. You can go back to total quality management. You can go back to any system. It's all plan, do, check, act. And then everything is euphemisms around that, right? But Agile comes out and starts talking about these 2-week iterations. But what was interesting is all of the language was about seeking success. So it's the exact same. A lot of the ceremonies are the same. The activities that you do the same. The conversations that you have are the same. But the difference is how do we seek success versus avoid failure? And that was such a huge kind of aha moment for me as I was going through that. Because now when we start to say seeking success, failure is a success. Basically, when we start a project, there's 37 unknowns. And we say, okay, we're going to go down this path and we're going to find out it doesn't work. Well, great. We've eliminated one of those unknown branches. Now we know, and that's a success. We should celebrate that. Now we're down to 36 and we'll continue to go down this path until we get the right solution and the best solution to come out. John also talks about ideas that not just because you have an idea doesn't mean it's the best idea. There should be multiple versions of that idea. And Agile really tapped into that. And I think that's why it's becoming such a successful methodology, at least in terms of people wanting to adopt it. But there's a great success in failure, and that's based on how we see it. So we don't look at failure as dreadful. We look at failure as hopeful because we know it's taking us one step closer to that end solution.
Yeah.
I like that. Hey, I think John should add, until you have Mike's idea, you don't have all the ideas, right? That would be.
And that's on page 47 of the Ego book. So that's good.
Yeah. Rick, I love, let me just share this real quick, Diane. I love what you shared around risk, right? I've got a company I just launched a new contract with back at the end of last year. And one of the things they do every day is they have a team meeting every day, but the title of the meeting was the Daily Safety Huddle. And so they were putting the organization was wondering why they had leaders who wouldn't take risks. They wouldn't move forward. They wouldn't do anything different. And I made a subtle change that we've been rolling out and I'm doing some different things as well, but I changed it to the daily rally. I took the word safety out of it, right? Because they're keeping their team. Mm-hmm. Now, this is a healthcare organization, and they're keeping their team caught up. Oh, we got to be safe. We got to be safe. We got to be safe. Not take any risks, not do anything to move ourselves forward. So I just changed the title up to the daily rally. So I have them because we all know what a PAP rally is, right? It's to get people excited about a new vision, a new future. And it could be those little subtle things like that, Rick, in our communication. I think that's so good what you brought up. Sorry to Diane to jump on you there.
No, that was that. I love that because you were talking about the language, and even as Rick was talking about it, the risk-based versus the successes and how that felt, right? That whole risk aversion piece, like we're preventing every possible thing, every contingency plan. And when we talk about failure, and I've heard this a gazillion times, but I've been helping people and introducing Kat Cole's talk to them, right? And so Kat was talking about what failure really is. And it's an acronym. Now, we've all heard this acronym before, but it kind of boggled my mind how many people had not. It's first attempt in learning. And the thing that stuck out to me is that, Rick, you talked about it. It's an attempt, right? We now have 35 ways instead of 36. We need to focus on the attempts that we're moving forward. And I think that's giving permission. And Mike, that daily safety, well, we also need to make sure that our team knows that they're safe to fail. Right? There's no execution in a failure. It's an attempt in learning. And now how do we apply that? And even in that methodology, what are our lessons learned? And how do we apply that going forward and moving our foresight, our hindsight into foresight?
That's good. I think that's so important just to talk about that element, right? So we're so risk adverse. We are so afraid of failure that we don't step forward in it, right? So that's our team. As a leader, we know, we've got to take risk, but we've got to motivate the rest of the team. We've got to engage them so that they can take that step forward. And we need to assure them, hey, look, if we're not taking risk, if we're not being forthright in terms of what we're doing here and not potentially putting ourselves in a position where we might fail, then we're not going to move forward to it. We're going to fail if we don't try. So a couple of thoughts here as we map this thing out. I think it's about asking the right questions, right? And foresight is really about transferring. It's transferring some of that skill, some of that hope that Rick talked about by asking some questions in terms of what people want. Right. And one of my favorites, Ricky, talked about Agile, right? You're familiar with user stories, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Live and breathe user stories. I want to.
Yeah. Those are such a powerful tool, right? It's a foresight tool because what it does is it says, look, put your mind, the persona, in terms of who it is that needs a capability, a service, an offering, a solution that you're trying to bring to the table, right? So who is it, right? We put a couple examples in the book, and I'll share a couple of them here, but that template that Rick just mentioned, all right, fill in the blank, as a person, right? As a coach. In this case, let's talk about Al Ulbrichtson. He was the coach for University of Washington, the Olympic 1936 rowing team. As a coach, and then the next part is, I want. What do you want? As a leader, what do you want? What do you want for your team, essentially? Right? For Ulbrichtson, it was, I want my team to pace themselves. I want them to pace themselves. And you could say that Dungy had the same, essentially, statement to his team before they won the Super Bowl. And then the third part is, so that. So fill in that blank, right? I want to, so that. This is the outcome, the value that you want, right? So that they can have the reserves to finish strong, is Ulbrichtsen's take, right? Because he knew that it wasn't about the start, it was how they finish. And so he had to really ingrain in them, like, hey guys, look, you may not have the best start, you're not the strongest team out here, but you've got the stamina to be able to endure and make this thing happen. We're going to leverage those strengths, and I want you to stay strong, all right? Pace yourselves, be ready, and find a way. Of course, they did. They won every single race that year in 1936 and took the gold. Unbelievable. So we get to ask those same questions for ourselves and of our team. Let's think through those user stories of what we need to apply, because when we go through that, then we can start to really think about all the different players, the contributors, the shareholders and stakeholders that are going to be impacted by this, and really provide something of value. It's a Foresight tool. It's fantastic. And I encourage you guys. I use this personally. And when I do, it makes a big difference because it keeps things fresh. It puts the why back in front. That's the carrot.
So Paul, there's one trick that comes along with that, and it's something I do with my development teams when we kick off a project, right? So there's a user story, like you're saying, as a user, I want to be able to enter information into this tool so that I can do XYZ with it. But there's a large assumption as to what we know that we know what those words are. And so really quickly, what I do is we get 3x5 cards, and I say, okay, as a developer, you just told me you're done coding an aspect. Write down what that means. Right. And so for some developers, that means it's been unit tested, integrated, up, ready, documented, ready to go. Some means the code compiled, right? Everybody has a different definition of the word done. And so we flip it back over and we do a team agreement as to what the definition of done means. What is that agreement? So we all come to that agreement, and I say, okay, now flip the card over, and whose definition matches what we came up with? Who's 100% match? And there won't be a single one. Right. And so when we're reading a user story and we're interpreting it, we can't assume we know what it means. So if we can mess up the definition of the word done as much as we have here in this room, what are we going to do with those user requirements? We need to make sure that they're defined to a point that we understand what they meant when they said that in the user story as well.
Yeah, that's so good. And when we talk about collaboration, we're going to talk about that definition of done, because it's so important to have that agreement with your team on what is done. What's our definition of it? I love that. Any other thoughts, guys, before we close off with tip and challenge? All right. Well, again, it's time to close out our podcast. And once again, I want to thank our sponsor, Rick Morse. Rick, thank you so much for being a sponsor and being a producer of our show, really, and steering us in the right direction, giving us insight. Also want to thank Diane for being one of our in-studio guests. And Mike, this has been just great. So what's your tip and challenge to kind of close us off?
Yeah, I love the conversation that we've had today. We've said this before. People have to hear things 7 times before they hear it for the first time. And Diane shared something, the acrostic fail, first attempt in learning. I don't know if I've ever heard that before, but I heard it today for the first time, which was fantastic to me. I wrote it down. I needed to hear that, not only for myself, but to teach others. I love this story, the user story example. I got great insight from the 3 of you today. I mean, normally I'm the one with all the insight and y'all are learning from me, but today's been different. Today's been different. And I love that. I love that. So my tip, and I'm just having a little bit of fun here. My tip is you got to set your ego aside, right? As a leader, you got to be willing to set your ego aside and learn from others. You can only do that when you say, I don't have all the answers. Oftentimes leaders, they get promoted because they do have the answers, right? They're really good at what they can do and they have the answers. And then they step into this leadership role and they think, well, I got to have all the answers. I can't ask anybody. I'm getting paid to solve problems. And the greatest insight that I hope our listeners learn today is that we need to get answers from other people. We need to listen to other people so that we hear those things and so we can move forward. So for insight to really occur, you need the ideas of others. So here's the challenge. That's the tip. Here's the challenge. Slow down. Ask 3 questions before you make a decision. Ask 3 questions before you say, I have the answer. At least get the ideas of other people as a leader. I think that's one of the greatest things. I don't often do it enough, but it is still one of the greatest lessons I've learned as a leader, Paul.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah. Yeah, it's so good. I think this foresight element is critical for leadership, guys. It's critical. And it's one that I believe is skirted and missed. The reason why we have so many books on our shelf is because we want insight. Those are books we go grab and like, ooh, I want to get the insight on that. I mean, that's typically why people buy a book, right? And that's good. But put it into action. Take that step forward, because through that, you're going to gain the greatest insight you could possibly get, not just by reading, but by doing. So that's my tip and challenge for you guys today is don't just try to acquire the knowledge and Google for it. Go do it. Go do it. And you're going to get the insight. The hindsight will come next. We're going to talk about that next week. But foresight is really taking that step forward. Just go forward. And start applying it, and you're going to start to learn some really cool things. So, guys, this has been great. So, Mike, one more time, who's our sponsor today?
Ricky, don't lose my number. I don't know the rest of the words. That's all I can think of. Rick A. Morris. Rick is. I have a lot of fun with Rick, but it's always good to talk about Rick as a sponsor. Great project manager. Up levels a lot of what we do on the Breaking Average podcast as well. And as I said earlier, if you have a project that's stuck, or someone that has a project that's stuck, Rick is your guy. Rick A, the letter A, rickamorris.com.
Fantastic. Well, guys, thanks for being a part of this conversation. It's great. We want to invite all our listeners and those watching, the viewers, go to our website, breakingaverage.com. Just go to breakingaverage.com, click the podcast link, look for the leader link, right? We're interested in gaining insights from different leaders. So we want to hear from them. Go to breakingaveragepodcast.com/leader. And a great topic again today on the Breaking Average podcast. I just love what we're doing, guys. And I really appreciate the insight that you guys offer all of us. And certainly our listeners, our viewers out there, we're interested in your insight. So let us hear back from you. We're all about feedback. Feedback really helps us propel forward and making an impact. This is true across all our lives, right? All the projects that we work on, we need that feedback. And we're going to be talking about that next week. So be sure to tune back in to the Breaking Average podcast. We'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening to the Breaking Average podcast. If you loved what you heard, please take a moment to subscribe. All opinions and comments expressed in this podcast are those of the participants and do not reflect the opinions or views of any of the advertisers, producers, or platforms. This show was produced by R Squared Multimedia. A special thank you to Milestone Melodies for our theme music. As you continue your day, what is one action that you can apply from this podcast to your life? Tune in for our next episode as we continue to challenge everyone to break average.